It's a Saturday afternoon in 1965, somewhere in London. A man is standing outside his bank, staring through the glass at a teller counter that closed 20 minutes ago. He's got cash in his account. He just can't get to it. Not today. Not until Monday morning. That might sound like a small inconvenience to us now, but in the 1960s, this was just how money worked. Banks opened when they wanted, closed when they wanted, and if you needed cash outside those hours, you were out of luck. No debit cards. No apps. No tapping your phone at checkout. Just you, your empty wallet, and a locked door. And here's the thing. The man standing outside that bank wasn't just some random customer. He actually ran a company that printed banknotes. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how much money was sitting behind that glass. He just couldn't touch it. That frustration is where our story really begins. Because within 2 years, that same man would help build a machine that fixed this problem, permanently, globally, for billions of people. We now call it the ATM. And its story is a lot stranger, messier, and more human than most people realize. To understand where the ATM came from, we actually have to go back almost 30 years earlier, to New York City, and to a man named Luther Simjian. Simjian was one of those restless inventor types. The kind of person who couldn't leave a problem alone once he noticed it. Over his lifetime, he'd patented well over 100 different devices, everything from an early flight simulator used to train pilots, to a self-focusing camera, to a teleprompter. In the late 1930s, he turned his attention to banking. His idea was simple on paper and radical in practice. A machine, built into the wall, that would let a customer deposit cash or checks without ever speaking to a teller. He called it the bankograph. It even had a small camera built in so it could photograph every deposit, partly for security, but honestly, partly just to convince nervous customers that their money wasn't disappearing into a hole in the wall. He convinced what's now known as Citicorp to give it a trial run in 1939. It failed. Badly. After about 6 months, the bank pulled the machines. Simjian later admitted, half joking, that the only people who seemed to actually use them regularly were people who preferred not to be seen by a bank teller at all. The general public just wasn't ready to trust a machine with their money. Not yet. So the idea sat there for almost 3 decades. A good idea, ahead of its moment. Fast forward to the 1960s, and the world had quietly started to change. Vending machines were dispensing chocolate bars and cigarettes on street corners. Public transit systems were experimenting with automated ticket machines. People were slowly, gradually, getting comfortable with the idea of a machine handling something that used to require a human being. Which brings us back to that man standing outside his bank on a Saturday. His name was John Shepard Barron, and he was the managing director of a company called De La Rue, a firm that, ironically, printed banknotes for a living. According to accounts from Barclay's own archives, the actual idea came to him later that evening, in the bath, thinking about his frustrating afternoon. If a vending machine could reliably dispense a chocolate bar to anyone who put in a coin, he thought, why couldn't a machine dispense cash to anyone who put in the right token? He pitched it to Barclays Bank. On the 27th of June 1967, the world's first cash machine was unveiled outside a Barclays branch on Enfield High Street in North London. There was even a small ceremony, a velvet curtain, a bank executive on hand to make it official, and the first withdrawal made by the actor Reg Varney, a familiar face from British television at the time, purely for the photo opportunity. It didn't work anything like today's ATMs. There were no plastic cards. Customers used paper vouchers printed with mildly radioactive ink so the machine sensor could read them, a detail that sounds almost unbelievable now, but it's true. Each voucher let you withdraw a maximum of £10. And you needed a code to use it, a number Shepard Barron initially imagined as 6 digits, based on his old military ID. His wife told him she'd never remember 6 numbers. 4, she said, was about her limit. So he settled on 4. And that's the reason, to this day, that most PIN numbers around the world are 4 digits long, because one woman in the 1960s didn't want to memorize 2 extra numbers. But here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, and honestly more interesting. Shepard Barron wasn't working alone in this race, and he wasn't even first by much. Just about a month after Enfield, a rival machine designed by an engineer named James Goodfellow went live at a different London bank. Goodfellow's version is actually the one that more closely resembles the ATMs we use today, because he's used a plastic card and a PIN system he'd patented, rather than radioactive paper vouchers. Goodfellow would later express real frustration that history gave nearly all the credit to Shepard Barron, when his own patented PIN technology was the version that the entire industry eventually adopted worldwide. And that same year, on the other side of the Atlantic, an American engineer named Don Wetzel, working for a company called Docudal, which had built its name manufacturing automated baggage handling systems, was developing his own version of the same idea, seemingly with no knowledge of what was happening in London. Wetzel's version used plastic cards with magnetic stripes, the technology that would eventually become the global standard. In September 1969, his machine was installed at a chemical bank branch on Long Island, New York, with a slogan that, looking back, was almost prophetic. The bank would open at 9 a.m. on September 2nd and never close again. You'd think a machine that hands out cash for free, well, from your own account, would be an instant hit. It wasn't. Banks in the late 1960s and early 1970s were genuinely nervous about these machines, and honestly, so were customers. Handing your money over to a person feels safe in a way that handing it to a metal box does not. There's a reason Simjian's original bankograph flopped in the 1930s, and a lot of that same hesitation carried over into this new generation of machines 30 years later. There were practical fears too. What if the machine miscounted your cash? What if it swallowed your card and gave you nothing back? What if someone tampered with it? Early machines occasionally jammed, misread vouchers, or simply broke down entirely, and in an era when most people had never interacted with any kind of automated financial technology, a single bad experience could sour an entire community on the idea. Banks also worried about something a little closer to home: their own employees. Bank tellers were a visible, trusted part of daily community life. Introducing a machine that could replace a human teller raised uncomfortable questions about jobs, and unions in several countries pushed back hard against rapid automation in banking. But something interesting happened as the 1970s went on. The same broader cultural shift that had made vending machines and automated transit tickets normal was steadily chipping away at people's hesitation. Self-service was becoming a part of everyday life: supermarkets, gas stations, ticket counters. An automated cash machine started to feel less like science fiction and more like the next logical step. Banks also realized something important. An ATM never takes a lunch break, never calls in sick, and never closes for the weekend. For banks trying to compete for customers, that was an enormous selling point. By the early to mid-1970s, machines were spreading, first cautiously, one branch at a time, then more aggressively, as competing banks realized that whichever of them got there first would win a real competitive advantage. Marketing departments leaned hard into showing off the novelty. In one memorable case, an Ohio bank sponsored a 6-hour movie marathon on local television, specifically trying to get female customers, historically an underserved banking demographic, comfortable with the idea of self-service banking. It's easy to laugh at that kind of marketing now. But it points to something real. Financial technology doesn't spread just because it's clever. It spreads because real people have to trust it enough to use it, and building that trust takes time, patience, and a whole lot of persistence from the people who believed in the idea in the first place. Then came the moment that, more than almost anything else, proved the ATM's real value, and it happened almost by accident. In 1977, Citibank's chairman made what at the time looked like a genuinely risky bet, spending more than $100 million to install ATMs across branches throughout New York City. That's a staggering amount of money for a piece of technology plenty of people still weren't fully sure they trusted. The very next January, a massive blizzard buried the city under 17 inches of snow. Bank branches shut down for days. But Citibank's ATMs kept running. With human tellers unreachable, ATM usage across the city jumped by roughly 20% almost overnight. Because when everything else in the city shut down, these machines simply didn't. Citibank leaned into the moment immediately, launching an advertising campaign built around a simple, confident line: "The city never sleeps." Posters showed customers trudging through snowdrifts specifically to reach an ATM, a small but powerful message that this machine would be there for you when literally nothing else was. After that, the floodgates opened. Bank after bank across the United States, and increasingly around the world, began racing to install their own networks. But there was still a problem holding the whole system back. Your card from one bank often didn't work at a different bank's machine, and it definitely didn't work while you were traveling somewhere else. Every bank had built its own island. The real transformation came with standardization, shared interbank networks that let a card issued by one institution work at machines owned by a completely different one. Once that happened, the entire value of the ATM changed. It wasn't just your bank's convenience feature anymore. It became a universal financial tool, one you could rely on almost anywhere, from almost any account. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, ATMs multiplied worldwide at a pace that's honestly hard to overstate. They moved out of bank lobbies and into grocery stores, airports, gas stations, shopping malls, anywhere people gathered and might need cash. For a huge stretch of the 20th century's final decades, the ATM quietly became one of the most trusted, most used pieces of everyday technology on the planet. And it wasn't just convenience for people who already had bank accounts. In many rural and lower-income communities, ATMs meaningfully expanded who could access basic banking services at all. People who couldn't easily make it to a branch during limited weekday hours suddenly had a reliable, always open way to manage their own money. That access mattered enormously, and in a lot of developing economies, it still does today. By the end of the 20th century, this strange machine, born out of one man's frustrating Saturday afternoon and shaped by inventors on two different continents, had fundamentally rewired how the entire world related to cash. But technology, by its nature, never stands still. And the ATM's own success eventually created the conditions for its next transformation. Through the 2000s and 2010s, ATMs kept evolving. Clunky mechanical buttons gave way to touchscreens. Machines started accepting deposits directly, without envelopes, using built-in scanners to read and count cash and checks instantly. Some newer machines could even dispense specific denominations on request, or recognize a customer through their bank's mobile app instead of a physical card at all. Cardless withdrawals, using a smartphone and a one-time code instead of a physical card, started appearing at machines around the world, letting customers get cash even if they'd left their wallet at home. Biometric authentication, using a fingerprint or a facial scan instead of a PIN, began rolling out in select markets as an added layer of security. In some ways, the ATM of the 2020s would be almost unrecognizable to Shepherd Barron or Wetzel, standing in front of their radioactive ink vouchers and mechanical card readers back in 1967 and 1969. And yet, at the exact same time this technology kept advancing, something else was happening that threatened the ATM's entire reason for existing: digital banking itself. Mobile wallets. Peer-to-peer payment apps. Contactless tap-to-pay at checkout. Suddenly, an entire generation of customers had less and less reason to ever withdraw physical cash in the first place. Why walk to a machine when your phone can pay for coffee, split a dinner bill with friends, or transfer rent money to a landlord, all without a single dollar bill changing hands? In wealthier, more digitally connected countries, this shift has been genuinely dramatic. Recent industry data shows ATM usage falling by close to 6% across major developed economies in a single recent year alone, with peer-to-peer apps in particular cutting into routine cash withdrawals among younger customers especially sharply. It would be easy to conclude from this that the ATM story is winding down, a 20th century invention gently fading out in the face of 21st century convenience. But that conclusion misses something important, and it brings us to where this story actually stands today. Here's the thing about the ATM's supposed decline. It's really only half the story, and it depends enormously on where in the world you're standing. B-roll, world map graphic, subtly highlighting regions of growth versus regions of decline. Yes, in places like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany, ATM numbers and cash withdrawals have been gradually shrinking as digital payments take over daily life. But in large parts of Africa, the Middle East, Central and Eastern Europe, and fast-growing economies across Asia, the exact opposite is happening. Countries like Egypt, Uzbekistan, and Bangladesh have seen their ATM networks expand significantly in recent years, not despite financial inclusion efforts, but specifically because of them. Governments and banks in these regions are actively installing more machines to bring basic cash access to rural and underserved communities that still depend heavily on physical currency for daily life. In parts of Africa today, cash still accounts for the overwhelming majority of everyday consumer transactions. For millions of people, an ATM isn't a nostalgic throwback. It's still the single most reliable way to receive wages, pay for goods, and participate in the broader economy at all. Globally, ATMs still process an almost unbelievable amount of money each year, well over $1 trillion in cash withdrawals annually, even as digital alternatives keep growing. The machine isn't disappearing. It's specializing, adapting, and settling into a different, more essential role depending entirely on where you live and what access to banking already looks like around you. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in this entire story. The ATM was never really about the technology itself, the vouchers, the magnetic stripes, the touchscreens, the biometric scanners. It was always about something much more human than that, the simple, universal need for people to reach their own money, on their own time, without asking anyone's permission. That need is exactly what drove a frustrated bank manager to imagine a solution in his bathtub back in 1965. It's what drove a Scottish engineer to patent a PIN system he believed in, even after watching someone else get most of the credit. It's what drove an American team in Texas to build their own version, without ever knowing they were racing anyone at all. And it's what continues to drive banks today, installing new machines in villages and towns that have never had reliable access to a bank branch. Nearly 60 years after that first machine appeared on a quiet London street, the ATM's story really isn't finished. It's just changing shape, the same way it always has, quietly built and rebuilt by people simply trying to solve one very old, very human problem: getting people access to what's already theirs. So the next time you walk up to a machine on a street corner, punch in 4 numbers almost without thinking, and watch it hand you cash in a few seconds, it might be worth remembering just how much history is packed into that ordinary moment. A frustrated man in a bathtub. A patent dispute that still isn't fully settled. A blizzard that proved a machine's worth almost by accident. And millions of people in every corner of the world still relying on that same basic idea today. It's a small machine, but it turns out it's got a genuinely big story.